All right, so before we start, we want to inform everyone here that we will be recording this meeting. So if later on you want to ask a question, but you don't want to be recorded, you don't want your image there, you can send your question through the chat and you keep your camera off throughout. And if you want to ask a question and don't mind being in the picture, you can raise your hand or put the word question in the chat and we can put you on live so that you can turn on your camera and ask your question yourself. So if you do that, we assume that you give us consent to the recording that will include your image. So big welcome to everyone who has joined this opening panel of our workshop, and especially to our speakers, members of LUCAS, the Leiden University Center for the Arts in Society, and especially the Modern and Contemporary Research Cluster, because this panel is also part of our monthly cluster meetings. The contributors to our volume who are present today, our students, everyone who has joined us from near or far away places, and yeah, including also members of the Rethinking Modern Greek Studies Network, because I see many of them in the audience, so welcome to you as well. Now, the occasion for organizing this workshop, as most of you know, was the publication of our edited volume in the fall of 2020, which had the same title, but with the title and subtitle inverted. So that's this one, Languages of Resistance, Transformation and Futurity in Mediterranean Crisis-Scapes, From Crisis to Critique. We had hoped that we'd be able to hold part of this workshop on campus, but we had, of course, to adjust to the COVID-19 mandates. But there are advantages to this format, one of them being that we were quite easily able to bring together a wonderful group of speakers from different places, including our two keynote speakers from basically the other side of the Atlantic, from California and Houston, Texas. Organizing this workshop with my colleagues, Janna, Houwen and Liesbeth Minnaard, simply felt like continuing a long-standing collaboration that has taken many forms through the years: joint publications, collaborative teaching, workshops, seminars. One of them was a panel at the ACLA, the American Comparative Literature Association conference in Utrecht, that the three of us organized in July 2017. And this was the panel that actually kind of planted the seeds for this, for our volume and this workshop, as many of the essays of the volume are based on talks by participants there. Now, Liesbeth's and Janna's and my research preoccupations are different, but they do share a concern with contemporary frameworks of crisis and the ways these frameworks produce temporal experiences, how they rehash or disrupt narratives of the past or broker specific outlooks of the future. And these concerns are also at the heart of the network Crisis and Critique that we've set up in Leiden, also together with our colleague Astrid van Wijnberg, and they are also at the heart of the volume we are launching today. So, well, if this workshop sparks your interest in the book, colleagues or students from Leiden can actually access the full online version of the book through our library. Now, for those who may be interested in getting the book and well, have funding for books, we've received a special discount flyer by the publisher until April 1. So this might be a good opportunity, since it is, unfortunately, as with many academic publications, not really a cheap book. So if you want to use the discount, I'll put the token that you'll need now in the chat. A few words perhaps about the book and the framework of the workshop. But the term crisis has been overused actually in public rhetoric in the last few years, so much that its uses today sound self-evident as the current state of things or the new normal. So who in this past year, for example, hasn't, that has been marked by the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, would deny that we are in crisis. And yet this we, of course, is never a singular we. It contains a huge range of different experiences of being in crisis. So as we tag these current conditions, the condition as a crisis, we need to acknowledge that crisis doesn't mean or doesn't feel the same to everyone. The effects of this pandemic are uneven, and the distribution of vulnerability that it entails is unequal in different countries, regions, groups, along lines of age, gender, race, profession, or ethnicity. And this declared crisis also brings the transversal character of different crises on a global level into sharp relief. So also, for example, the environmental crisis, economic crises that are emerging, or even the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. So although declaring a crisis is definitely not new, perhaps the degree in which declared crises intertwine and overlap and traverse each other on a global scale is somewhat new. And this challenges us to test and rethink our vocabularies, but also to address these phenomena from combined perspectives. Now, the extended mobilization of crisis today often works to legitimize repressive and securitarian politics that involve military interventions or states of emergency, the suspension of rights, biopolitical control, or austerity measures. And as we know, crisis rhetoric can also breed xenophobic or racist attitudes, disaster narratives, fake news, and so on. So what we can call the neoliberal governmentality of crisis, and especially the forms it has taken in sites around the Mediterranean, is basically the framework in which our book intervenes. So in this book, we approach crisis not as an objective phenomenon, but, and here we follow Janet Reutemann, Nicholas Dezenova, and many others. We see it as a performative, meaning-making concept and a framing, kind of framing that authorizes certain narratives while precluding others. Now, the essays in the book, they focus on different frameworks of crisis in the Mediterranean. To mention a few examples, many deal with the declared so-called refugee crisis, the European debt crisis and its impact, especially on the European South, the political crisis in Turkey, or the decades-old Palestinian question. And they trace how such frameworks mine, but also reconfigure past narratives or form experiences of the present and manage ways of thinking the future. And a lot of the essays also foreground the role of literature or cinema, arts, protest cultures, and other forms of cultural production in questioning the governmentality of crisis or in triggering crisis of representation. So if crisis is often, let's say, hijacked by far-right or anti-democratic agendas, or if involved also in an industry of crisis writing, we ask in the book if there are ways to salvage crisis as a concept that can actually do the work of critique. So is the term crisis too tainted or too saturated, or could it be part of contrarian or transformative vocabularies by scholars, activists, or artists? And can these concepts form new grammars of protest and critique? The essays in this volume offer sometimes conflicting answers to this question, either proposing, redefinitions of crisis, or sometimes rejecting the concept altogether. So our thinking or rethinking of crisis and critique takes shape through the prism of Mediterranean Crisis-Scapes. And in recent years, the Mediterranean has been mainly cast as a hotbed of crisis and conflicts. But we wanted to draw attention to the region not just as a ring of fire, let's say, or a complex of crisis-scapes, but also as a space that can generate alternatives to Eurocentric models and representational regimes, or a breeding ground for new languages of decolonization, artistic imaginaries, and other conceptions of community or subjectivity through and against and beyond frameworks of crisis. So, for example, despite the very bitter aftermath of the Arab Spring, these events have set forth modes of expression or belonging that still resonate in artistic or social practices in sometimes unexpected ways. Or also, on the other side of the Mediterranean, from the financial crisis in Southern Europe, you also have new, bold artistic grammars, strange grammars emerging, such as the cinema of the Greek weird wave. And I'm mentioning this because it will be one of the topics of our first panels, of the first panel today. Okay, so before we move to the speakers and the first panel, just a few words of thanks. We want to thank the OSL, the Netherlands Research School for Literary Studies, and its executive scientific director, Pablo Valdivia, and its program director, Alberto Godioli, for supporting the workshop financially, organizationally, and conceptually, and also the office manager of OSL, Santalo Leierhoek, for her assistance too. We're also very grateful to Lucas, the Leiden University Center for the Arts and Society, for supporting this event financially and with the organization. And so, yeah, we want to say big thanks to the Lucas director, Sibylle Lames, the management team, and our Lucas secretary, Viola Stoop, for their support. And last but definitely not least, we also want to thank our wonderful assistant, Monica Lensing, for her great help with organizing this event and for keeping her cool with technical issues and solving them efficiently. We're also counting on her help during the workshop, as with previous meetings. So if anyone experiences problems with Kaltura, you can contact Monica at the address that I'm going to put now in the chat. All right, a couple of practicalities. So, like I said before, if you want to ask a question but don't want to be recorded, just put it in the chat. Otherwise, raise your hand and we'll give you the word. The format we've devised for the panel is this. We've kind of paired the speakers in two groups based on the common thematic lines of their essays, but also differences in their approaches. So Geli, Mademli, and Dimitris Papanikolaou are the first pair with essays dealing with the Greek cinema, the cinema of the Greek weird wave, and documentary projects produced during the Greek financial crisis, respectively. And then in the second half, we'll listen to Ipek, Çelik, Rappas, Diego, Benegas, Loyo, and Liesbeth Minnaard, whose essays address refugee art and literature through works that either move beyond or complicate dominant discourses and representational modes that surround the so-called refugee crisis. We've asked the speakers to briefly present their essays and then respond to each other's essays briefly, and then, of course, enter into discussion with the audience as well. And we'll structure this in two parts. After the first part, we'll have a very short break. And we also hope at the end to have some room for a general discussion involving all the speakers. Right, so I now have the pleasure of introducing the first pair of speakers who are also dear friends of mine, Geli Mademli and Dimitris Papanikolaou. Geli is finishing currently her PhD at the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis at the University of Amsterdam. And she's working on Greek film heritage and the concept of crisis as a modality of media archaeology. She's also doing many other things. She has taught at the University of Amsterdam and Amsterdam University College. And she also collaborates with the Thessaloniki International Film Festival and Documentary Festival as publications coordinator, and the Syros International Film Festival as a film programmer. And she also works as a freelance journalist and translator. Now, Dimitris Papanikolaou is Associate Professor of Modern Greek at the University of Oxford, and he works in modern Greek studies, cultural studies, literary theory, and queer theory. He has written many books. I'll mention the most recent ones, Cavafy and the Poetics of Sexuality, from 2014, and There is Something About the Family, Nation, Desire, and Kinship in a Time of Crisis from 2018. Both of these were in Greek. And he has just published the monograph Greek Weird Wave, a Cinema of Biopolitics with Edinburgh University Press, which will be available very soon, or maybe perhaps already. He will tell us if that's the case. And that book is closely connected to his essay in our volume that he will present today. So, and if I'm allowed to mention also that Dimitris and I, together with Christina Getgodaite, who is also here today, have been working very closely in the context of the Rethinking Modern Greek Studies network that we initiated 1.5 years ago, and many of its members are here today, so that's really nice to see. All right, so I will now give the word to Geli. Geli, please unmute yourself. Is the unmute button not working?
Okay.
Yeah.
It does now. It takes 2 steps, as everything lately. So first of all, thank you so much, Maria, and everyone for this kind invitation, for this very rich introduction, not only of my work, but the context of our meeting here today. I hope to address certain things with my introduction today. And thank you also for pairing me with Dimitris Papanikolaou, whose work, particularly on archive trouble, has been really important for my own research, which I hope to finish, as you said, this year. So the article that is featured in the volume is the last part of my analysis, my research on the intersection between crisis discourses and Greek film heritage. And I thought of picking up 2 case studies and analyzing pieces of work that address more openly with what is considered documentation, but in a creative mode. So the first case that sparkled my interest, titled The Prism GR, was conceived by Nina Maria Paschalidou and Nikos Katsaunis, and unraveled as a transmedia project launched as an online platform, a feature narrative documentary, and an installation presenting the gist of the research and encounters with local populations in different areas of the country. The Prism comprises 27 short films that were shot over the course of a year in different areas in Greece, both in the urban centers and the periphery of the country, by 14 photojournalists who have never been trained in filmmaking. Just to open a parenthesis, since these 2 projects are available online, I would be happy to circulate, at least their interface might be telling of what am I talking about. I'll be happy to circulate the links shortly after my presentation. So in what concerns the second case, titled The Caravan Project, this was conceived by Stratis Voyadzis and Thekla Malamu, 2 documentary makers, mostly trained in shorter formats. And it was presented as a living story archive created through a traveling practice, following what was defined as an urgent impromptu ethnography in the Greek milestone. So they presented the film documents either ad hoc, in workshop formats engaging local populations, in installation in large yurtas in varying locales in the country, or through conventional festival circuits as autonomous films focusing on different individuals narrating their life stories. So interestingly, despite the fact that these 2 projects were by no means interrelated, they were both released in a seminal year for Greece and for the development of a specificity in the discourse of crisis, as I understand it, and the circulation of images of a regenerated crisis-struck country in international media. So this year, 2011, in this year, the recession accelerated, austerity measures were further established, along with the advent of structural reforms and the diffusion of social frustration with varying manifestations in the public sphere. So I find it important that in this same year, 2 similar yet distinct documentary projects were initiated by small teams of Greek researchers and filmmakers as they apply, as I argue, alternative methodologies and hybrid modes in representing reality. I find the 2 projects compelling for their own reasons, as they resist what John Law and Ruth Benschop define as the representations politics of ontology. A quote, Pictures, and particularly those related to crisis, generate an unequal distribution of power through a composite of an invisible system of exclusions, by separating the subject from the object, by choosing what to leave or frame unnarrated or undepicted, by delineating surfaces of significance over an indefinite space. Representations reenact cultural assumptions and work as functional substitutes, standing for larger areas of perception. So interestingly, the two documentary projects resist this system, I argue, by critically reimagining another widely contested practice, namely the archive. So by showcasing the complex relationship between humans, technological devices, stories, and pictures, material and immaterial worlds, they openly acknowledge that archives, be they virtual or physical, are necessarily territorial entities and thus colonial inventions, expanding in space and defining areas of control and access. In my reading, the two archival projects bring together a critical approach in archivization and are subverting the power in the archive, and the archive of crisis in particular. Next to rendering visible these mechanisms of exclusion, they understand interactivity with the audience as an emancipatory practice. Through this practice, the subject that encounters the archive leaves aside the salient documentary practices and narratives of otherness, which are deeply rooted in structures of classification and representation. As the format of this meeting cannot allow me to get into too much detail of analysis, I will present the sum of it, so a comparison of the two projects in terms of similarities and differences. But I will insist in one similarity that can qualify as the core argument of my article. So both endeavors introduce themselves as acts of collective documentation, where the camera is employed to engage the filmed subjects in practices of storytelling around their individual experience of crisis in their everyday environments. They develop web interfaces as key platforms for the dissemination of these products, and consider digital technologies part and parcel with the fragmentary nature of their content. Yet whereas the PRISM GR understands the endeavor also as a self-funded project of educational value that only received in-kind sponsorship and unraveled from its outset as a transmedia project, not as a cross-media, this is kind of important for my argument, that would bring together a set of different media agencies, the Caravan project was triggered by the production of a short doc and only later expanded as the rhizomatic expansion of the Stories archive. And notably, it was generously supported by Stavros Niarchos Foundation, one of the leading cultural organizations in Greece in the years of recession. And of course, this raised questions regarding the effectiveness of its critique to the institutionalization of the archive. Yet the originality of these archival gestures lies in the capacity to perform the titular metaphors, the prism and the caravan respectively, using these terms as critical tools that define the relationship between the archive, its maker, and its user. So in the case of the prism, the title of the project notably underlines the reflective and distorting qualities of the prism as an optical device, while connoting an individual viewpoint that maintains singularity while intersecting with other observational trajectories on Greek reality. The prism platform does not prioritize certain narrative elements over others, as the integrity of the project lies in supplementarity. Photos, interviews, and time lapses are presented in counterpoint under the archive menu, featuring different fragments of the same subject matter and presenting them in the form of unedited footage. Yet the featured narratives of individuals are neither random nor representative of a social group, a class, milieu, but of people that live in what John Law again describes as a fractiverse, partially participating in multiple realities and not in a single container universe. Utterly resisting the one story, many channels doctrine that is associated with cross-media communication, the project does not incorporate unified messages across multiple media, but resists the notion of unification. And this is where the trans element returns and reiterates through this transfiguration. So in the narrative this platform features, subjects of Greek crisis do not inhabit a world with multiple overlapping voices, They do not inhabit a world that favors categorization and difference through a comparison of different conceptions of the same reality of crisis. Rather, they perform fractal realities where the crystal structure mediates, enacts, and converges different sets of relations between singular subjectivities. The makers of the archive, Pascalidou and Katsaounis, seem to suggest that the reality of crisis should not be perceived as a realm that can be scrutinized, quantified, archived, and shared, but rather as a realm whose singular ontology can never be disputed. Crisis is found in a constant process of crystallization, a process of inclusion, fusion, and expansion, whose end product remains a non-fixed structure. But if in the case of the prism, the use of a metaphor evokes a radical media agency and critical interactivity, the Caravan project understands the word metaphor literally, as derived from metaphora, which means transfer in Greek, and implements an idea of an archive transferring artifacts, that is, moving images, as it moves itself in space and on the map. So in this case, the Caravan stands as a metaphor for a practice of nomadic thought. At the same time, the Caravan project is grounded in yet another act of metaphor, but this time specific to film history, as the presence of the motor vehicle alludes to early cinematic practices. Already from the first days of cinema, the train, as an automobile medium and an emblem of modernity, was comfortably correlated with the newly introduced medium, and not only because of the Lumiere's rather emblematic The Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat Station, which actually was commonly but falsely coined as the first film to be presented in a public screening in 1896. So this is the founding myth of cinema. The most influential cases of these motor vehicles in cinema history are no other than the agit trains and buses of the Soviet Revolution, whose initial scope was supplying the Red Army and delivering the Communist Party's messages to people in the periphery of the Soviet Union through the expansive railway network. These vessels were to become multi-leveled agitators and film factories on reels. Constituting an indirect reference to Vertov's vans and following Medevkin's principles on the interrelatedness between the production space and the screening place, the archival structure that the Caravan project uses as its foundation is one that reveals the genealogies of the cinematic medium, exactly because it performs earlier versions of the cinematic dispositives, the apparatuses, the mechanisms of creating vision and meaning. Consequently, this archiving vehicle proves that archives may contain inscriptions of different narratives around their own genealogy, or perform their genealogy by including different archival constellations. So coexisting modules of the past and the present are manifested here in the same way that every crisis contains other crises. In lieu of a conclusion, you might wonder, okay, this all sounds interesting, but to put it bluntly, what is exactly at stake here? Why are we even bothering to use the critical reconception of the archive in these two documentary projects to better understand the problem in the narrative representations of crisis? This is where the work of Dimitris Papanikolaou enters the frame, and of course I'm using this metaphor on purpose. So to save some time here and leave more for discussion, also among us, but also with all the participants here, I will leave it here, and I will thank you once again for inviting me.
So thank you, Geli. I will go ahead and give the word to Dimitris right away. So Dimitris, go ahead. You are still on mute, by the way.
Figure out. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
can you hear me?
Yes, yes. I'll put your PowerPoint, Dimitri. Just a second.
Okay, that's great. I mean, that's very interesting. I can see myself. Okay. I'm kind of wary of technology today for reasons that I will talk about in a minute. So at any point, if you stop hearing me, please sort of stop me and say so wave a hand. I mean, I can see Liesbeth there, so just wave a hand. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation, for this book, for everything that your research projects and research group stands for. I've learned a lot in recent years, working close with all of you, especially Maria, but also most of the other people who will be presenting and talking today. And one of the things that I think groups like that teaches is the skill of working together in this particular period, and why this is important. If I, Geli, if I may, you will respond afterwards again, or
yeah.
How did you structure that?
I followed
or did you organize both of them together? I didn't.
I followed the guidelines and will respond.
Go on. We were asked to both sort of respond to each other's work, but also present what we have included in this publication. And if I may, I would like to start with an immediate response to what Geli has said. So I will do my response first and then present my own work a little.
Then if this is the case,
I might... It is true that for all the conversations we have had, all the discussion that's been done on Greek cinema in recent years, very little has been, I haven't started with the PowerPoint yet, very little has been said about documentaries. However, documentary filmmaking has been very much in the center of an effort to encapsulate what became the paradigm of crisis in recent recent years in the, at least this part of the world, the Greek crisis. Various documentary projects, but also, as Geli brilliantly says and argues in her work, various documentary modes. There is a favorite of mine that is not touched upon in the book, which is called Micropolis, the micro cities, and presents yet a different, an even third modality to what Geli has already mentioned. And what interests me in all those documentaries that came out of the Greek crisis, especially those that Geli mentioned, and if you add a couple too, like micro cities, is this tendency of people interviewed to sort of two things. First, to treat the documentarists, the documentary makers, and the group as discussants, to play with them. In the particular context, they know what they're talking about, they know why there is interest in the Greek crisis, in Greece at the moment, etc. The second is their tendency to do something weird, their tendency to do something that comes out of the of what you would expect. And this I see going across documentaries, and I find it very interesting because it relates directly to what I'm going on to say, talking about fiction films. Watching these documentaries, talking with people like Geli or Maria or Liesbeth, and trying to make sense of it all in the last 10, 15 years, I have more and more realized that if we are to talk about new modes of representation during these critical periods, if we are to talk more about languages of critique and crisis, we need to focus on ways of, or rather technologies of representation and how these change and how we interact with them. We also need to focus on technologies of embodiment and what these, what new role these play in the whole game of representation and the language of crisis. And we need to talk about technologies of participation. So technologies of representation are not alone. They are now so much more intertwined with technologies of embodiment and technologies of participation. Go back and watch some of these documentaries, and of course, Greece is not alone there. We can talk about this in the discussion, and you can see how the three intertwine. Technologies of participation, technologies of embodiment, and how they intertwine with technologies of representation as these move on and develop constantly. I tend to call all this new assemblage, or this new assortment of assemblages, if I may double the metaphor here. I tend to call it biopolitical realism, accepting therefore that our well-known capitalist realism has sort of run its course, or gotten to a point where it is being transformed now to a new modality. And we might wish to think of this as biopolitical realism. And here is where I turn to fiction in the last 10-15 fiction films of the last 10-15 years in Greece, and I will start with my PowerPoint. It has been called the Greek weird wave, but you may as well wish to think of it as another way of doing a cinema of biopolitics. There are many around the world today. These are cinemas of biopolitics. If we go to the next slide, do I have, can I move these slides myself? No, I can't. So, can I?
Yes, you can. Yes.
Okay, then I just did it. Okay, great. Let me just try. Yes, I can. Okay, perfect. This is a new platform. This is a scene from a capture from Hector Asligizos, is kind of celebrated around the world, especially because it kind of performed a kind of crisis imagery there, with the boy not finding food to eat, etc. This Hector Asligizos is boy eating the bird's food. Actually, in the film, the boy does that. He actually ends up eating the bird's food. He also peregrinates in an empty block of flats, and in a pretty much equally empty city. This is a famous image from Athina Rachel Tsangari's Attenberg 2010, equally celebrated. It was actually on a review of this film that the term Greek weird wave that you may have heard has been first proposed. In the film, Bella and her best friend, Marina, are performing awkward walks around an empty, weirdly empty town. Also, Marina visits often her father in hospital. This is a picture from the film Pity that I want you to sort of keep in mind. It was while trying to put that picture in the end of my PowerPoint that my computer crashed 20 or 30 minutes ago. So it still remained there. Remember that picture. But still is an empty seaside, and there is a dog alone. This is how the film ends. This is a scene from Sofia Exarchus Park, 2016. This empty space there, where only a group of friends will be for the duration of the film, is one of the old Olympic Games settlements for the 2004 Olympics. Now, of course, getting almost unusable. And certainly empty. This is a scene from Santan, 2017, a doctor and his, beloved and/or victim. This is a scene from last year's Triumph in Cannes short film, The Distance Between Us and the Sky by Vasilis Kekatos. This is an image of the same year, 2009 film with this long title, not to be unpleasant, but we need to have a serious talk. In this pretty empty world, there is an anxiety over a new virus. This is a 2019 film, and the main character needs to call every single partner he has had in the past in order to tell them about this. We see him in empty cities because of the virus, and we see him also in hospital. These are all films that Greeks made in the last 15 years before COVID. So, of course, when COVID started, it was kind of funny to see how all these films made 10, 15 years ago were resonating what we were living with, constant images of hospitalizations and at the same time empty cities. I'm not making a huge point here, and I can return to this in the discussion, but my main argument in the piece you have in the collection, as well as in this book that's coming out in a week or so, Greek Weird Wave, A Cinema of Biopolitics, it is the following. It is precisely because the Greek fiction films of the last 10, 15 years were so enmeshed in this and immersed in this kind of reality of everyday biopolitics, whereby the body of the individual and every single individual, their participation in livability and the fate of a population were constantly intermingled and sort of engaged with or focused upon in constant discursive management in the world and in Greece. It is precisely because of this intense biopolitical presence that Greeks went through that their films also developed techniques of trying not necessarily to capture the moment, but deal with it, okay? For those of you who want to do that test, actually it's eerily prefiguring imagery that we see more and more today. And why is that? By the way, those of you who have who want to know more about the Greek Weird Wave, I'm giving you here a slide. Hopefully, you can take a you can take a capture. You will read here more details about the Greek Weird Wave, but of course the organizers can forward the PowerPoint for those of you who want to have more information. What is interesting, and you will see also in the chapter that I have included in the in the book we are discussing today, but also in other work and in my book, is that if we then go back to those films, we can perhaps see more and more the complex ways in which the biopolitical present can be engaged with. I'm not going to talk here about a simple representation, as I said in the beginning, of biopolitics in contemporary crisis, in plural. No, you have to think how technologies of representation, technologies of embodiment, and technologies of participation intertwine, and how this creates a new frame for such films like the films of the Greek Weird Wave. Thus, for instance, films that I talk about in my contribution to the to my colleague's volume, films like the 2018 PT, 2013 Miss Violence, 2019 Dogtooth, see the wide range of these decades pretty much is what we're interested in, are all films in which you see a lot of family and its governmentality, a lot of hospital and its decision-making processes about livability and what it means to be alive or dead, so biopolitics, necropolitics, and a lot of registering of bodies, also figuratively. See here after a fall, how the body of a young girl is almost graphed on the ground of her garden. This you will see constantly in Greek Weird Wave. A lot of power, a lot of abuse, a lot of violence, and a lot of bodies trying to find some way out, to do something, to counter something. Here, for those of you who want to use this later in the discussions, I know this is a long workshop. I often go back to old nice Foucault and his later work, often in English, translated as The Politics of Truth. This reflective indocility, this voluntary in servitude that subjects then, including subjects in visual representation, try to engage in. If we are to talk about biopolitical realism, and now I think if I'm reading you right, I have 1-2 minutes to finish, right? Is this right, Maria?
Well, even less, but go ahead. Sure.
I'm happy with that. So I'll take 2 minutes only. If we are to think of biopolitical realism properly, we will have to think about new modalities of representation, but also of participation, the new frames constantly that life takes, and that include very centrally the visual in them, and the representation becomes very much part now of the biopolitical constantly. I'm not saying it was not there in the beginning, but is constantly more and more ingrained there. But also those moments of reflective indocility, those desubjectifications that may lead somewhere or may not. Those films that I have included in my various discussions, and here in the presentation there's a second part with many photographs from Dogtooth. Those of you who will ask for the PowerPoint will see they're pretty relying there. I mean, you can understand where I'm getting just by watching the photographs. That old film Dogtooth, what came afterwards, the poetics not only of Yorgos Lanthimos, who is a central director of the Greek Weird Wave, but a whole community of people engaged with cinema in Greece. What they tried perhaps to say, and this is my argument, is that we are in a new period. We are in a new period where we are set up to dance, but yet again we may dance slightly differently, slightly wrongly. Those of you who have seen Dogtooth see where I'm coming from here, and we might thus complicate a number of frames of reference, including national allegory, but of course a number of frames of referencing that go back to shape our biopolitical world, while questioning our participation in it, while questioning whether we have the means to answer back. Well, biopolitical realism, if anything, is that kind of weird moment where you're very much aware of the setting of representation in a critical moment, and you do something slightly unexpected, something indeed weird. It is also a moment, to go back to that image that caused my computer crash, a moment of persistence and cruel optimism, whereby you realize that perhaps you're constantly being represented. Somebody is expecting you, just as you are coming out of the sea. But then, as that dog in that film, and those of you who will read my essay will realize exactly why I'm using this image. You still persist. You will still come closer to the picture and demand to be part of it. So, in a nutshell, what I learned from watching 15 years of Greek films and trying to engage with how that filmic representation perhaps was or was not a comment on the Greek crisis, what I learned was this demand to be in the picture, and also that in biopolitical realism, this is not a very simple affair.
So thank you so much, Dimitris. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes. So thank you, Dimitris and Geli, so much for these very stimulating presentations of your essays. I will give the word immediately to Geli, who will respond briefly to Dimitris' essay or what he has told us. And then Dimitris will respond to Geli briefly, and then we can open it up.
No, I've responded already. I did my response in the beginning of the...
That's right. Sorry. Yes, you did. Sorry.
And maybe I should have done the same as it did. I didn't make an abrupt cut, to use a cinematic term, just to return to my conclusion-like paragraph with, okay, what is at stake in using metaphors, at least in my article. So, Dimitri, in one of your previous works, you have coined the term archive trouble as the ultimate modality that defines the public sphere, the cultural milieu in crisis Greece. It is ultimate as it establishes the experience of history in the present, and it also reveals the inconsistencies of any attempt to record and therefore historicize fragment of the inescapable reality of crisis. So this condition presents a very complex structure of metaphor, metonymy, allegory that invites the audience to decide their position towards those modes. And I hope I have adequately suggested how these specific cases in these archival documentaries in turn trouble the archive through inviting the audience to engage with these metaphors in a critical way, to be present, if you will, to use the phrase in which you concluded. And I find that in your article, you demonstrate beautifully the different registers in which the audience is invited to embrace these figures of speech, so as to not only decipher what we see on screen, but also to understand more profoundly the framework of an important body of production and the economies of effect that are mobilized through this production. So I think that the vibrant presence of love, feeling, and the body are more than, in your text, are more than telling in this direction. So your unique take in what was often labeled a Greek cinema of crisis, an umbrella term that included the work of all Greek art house directors who traveled in the international circuit, receiving both international acclaim and official distribution, renders this process of branding a cultural product indicative of what you call intense biopolitical present. Yet in my piece, I pre-consider this branding an extension of categorical archival thinking that comes from the outside in a process of standardization that more often than not excludes and not includes aesthetic tropes that invite the viewer to participate in what takes place on screen. So shifting the perspective from the viewer to the maker, I tend to lean towards the thought that more than a consensus, the key actors in the network of affects approach the term as a means to an end, like a canon-making rule that applies to all globalized creative industries, which are all too often dependent on classificatory systems for their promotion in a vast landscape of production. And this is exactly this hypothesis, next to what I understand as laboratory aesthetics of Greek New Wave, that informs my focus on endeavors that in principle openly state that their scope is documenting the real and thus tackle a social contract around reality. So in other words, it's exactly because of this understanding of the Greek weird wave that the documentary endeavors have a surplus value, maybe. They do address reality as a counterbalance to a hermetic system of representation, where there's no way out, where our engagement includes its critique. So following the more tangible strand of capital realism, a framework that, in your words, conditions the production of culture, work, education, and financial production, which now also furnishes with a major lens through which to view how the bodies of the individual and the population are documented. So seeing it retrospectively, my analysis of the transmedia environment is a paradigm that also questions what we talk about when we talk about participation and interactivity in different modes in technologies of participation. So in extension, I agree with your point that instead of breaking away from biopolitical realism, they ended up participating in it differently, the projects, pushing it to a very different direction. But this different direction makes it all different. And I think that this is the point where our articles meet again. I was immersed into your framing of the weird wave as a participatory mode. and as such, as a process of emancipation and empowerment. So I was thrilled to read about the technologies of representation, not as concealed, inaccessible apparati that black box contemporary politics, but as key factors whose sweeping agency in and beyond the frame prompt us to engage more critically with the inescapable aspect of reality. And in so doing, we're not entering a thought experiment, but a mode that we cannot oversee, a realm that takes into account affective investments and reactions, which can thus interrelate with their analysis of concepts and their metonymical relation to specific events, political pronouncements, social movements, production and promotion tactics, as well as accounts of the communities of viewers that have received these films and the use they have made of them. This is, of course, the quote from the conclusion of your article, and I think this can be the landing point where you ended in your presentation as well. So the way I see it, we do arrive in similar conclusions on the technologies of representation and their importance following different strands and paths in making them.
Thank you, Geli, for this response to Dimitris. I don't know if Dimitris, if you want to respond to that before we open it up.
When I answer, if there are questions, I will also, it's just to say I completely agree. And of course, the reason we reach similar conclusions, this may be seen by the audience also if the audience reads, if people read all of the essays actually in that book, see other work where we have all collaborated. The reason we reach similar conclusions is that not only that we have been working closely together, most of us, is that we participate in similar communities of engagement. And this, I'm not talking about critical engagement, various engagements with the visual, with the political, with the contemporary, with the educational. And we should put this in as well. Both Geli and I have been arguing for complex ways to treat, say, films. This includes, of course, our own positioning as academics, intellectuals, participants in groups, etc.
All right. Well, I want to open up the discussion to anyone who would like to ask something on either of these presentations or address a question to both speakers. I also have a couple of questions in mind, but I will save them and see if we have time. So let me repeat again that if anyone anybody can put a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand or put question in the chat so that you can we can put you on live and you can ask your question. And I'm now checking the chat as we speak. No questions yet. There's some other comments. All right, so and I'm also checking if somebody has their hands raised.
I will also share the links to the projects with a more, not for the sake of questioning, of course, but just as a supplement to what I described, as I understand that there needs to be a different involvement with the object of analysis itself.
Oh, there is a hand. I understand. Okay, yeah, Juan, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. You are on live, so if you unmute yourself, we will be able to hear you. We cannot hear you yet. No, still not. Then you'll have to type your question. Sorry about that, but now you appear to be muted, so you might want to try again to unmute yourself. Sometimes it takes twice to work. No, okay, it doesn't seem to be working. So shall we, I don't know how long the question will be, so maybe as we wait for Juan to type his question, I want maybe to address a question that, I mean, you don't need, it was already addressed in your responses and in the presentations, but just to put it out there again, the question that Dimitris also asked towards the end of his presentation, the question of what is at stake here, and what the, let's say, the wider context in which these, for example, the mediatic techniques of technical assemblages that Geli talked about for fracturing, refracting the framework of crisis function, and how they resonate also beyond the Greek crisis. And I think, I mean, that was something that was definitely addressed also through the notion of biopolitical realism that obviously exceeds the Greek context of crisis, but perhaps also for our audience here, which is a mixed audience from different contexts, that would be a question that would be worth returning to. So what is, maybe in Geli's case, maybe Geli, let's say the symptomatic or paradigmatic value of the kind of documentary projects that you've been looking at. Yeah, I don't know if you would like to.
Well, I will answer in brief because I think that time is pressing us. I think that if I could just present a punchline of my argument is the rendering, the visibility of the mechanisms that create presentation and create archival constellations. So I think this is their unique perspective in what comprises an act of documenting reality. The archive is not just the end product of the of spectatorship, but it's also part of the process and takes part in the representational framing and making meaning. So, as I said, I'm trying to be very concise here, and I can elaborate more maybe, but I think this is where the technologies of participation are also very valuable and present.
Thanks, Geli. Dimitri, do you also want to say something? I saw you gesturing, so I'm just checking. We cannot hear. Yes. No.
Yeah, I've got something to say, and I will also respond to one of the questions in the chat. The other one is for Geli. Okay. In a brilliant moment in Geli's article and in other work, I have to here address this. Geli has written Geli and her peers, who are a generation after us, if not two, were the people who taught us how to watch these new films. It is not a coincidence that their short essays, often on the internet, actually brought us new ways of thinking. And most of these people, interestingly, are unlike our generation, and because of the precarity of the young people in the job, in academia, etc., are people who work in film festivals and in other jobs related to film production, also in the university. They have all sorts of different, and then somehow they come up with a 2,000 word piece on the internet, and they have said it all. So Geli has a couple of those, and please, all of you can go and see them. But in her piece for the book, she has this brilliant moment where she talks about assemblage. Now, she talks and she doesn't. I mean, she talks about assemblage in a technical way, while also being fully aware of the big theoretical weight that there is there. And assemblage, in French, we normally take assemblage also to translate the French word agencement, is an interesting concept. Especially in the way it has been discussed in recent years. It's an interesting concept to discuss, to also address what's at stake here. Assemblage as in all these things together, working together, and somehow the moment a person is trying to get agency to do something, somehow this balance imposing on them, but also perhaps being rebalanced by them. That's agencement. It's an arrangement, an assortment that includes agency, but also precludes it. And in that sense, what we are talking about are communities of engagement and production of films and of watching films. Now, I realize I haven't addressed the question that's on chat, but I might. Why Greek films had so many empty spaces? It might be best to go to the question for Geli, and then I will address that other.
Yet interestingly, I think that what you responded responds to Juan's question really adequately, exactly because it includes this shift in perspective between the self and the other, and the constant fluid state of an assemblage, which has to do with human and non-human actors in this contract, if you will, in this convention.
Yeah, and questioning of the limits between self and other.
Exactly, yeah. And I think the digital conventions and the digital convergence really helps in this direction. So other than thank you so much for your kind note, and also for suggesting we belong to a different generation altogether, which is how. Sorry, I think I missed you for a sec.
Yeah, you're there.
Okay. The screen was frozen for a sec. But that's the agency of technology that is so accelerated that in the end, the discourse is driven also by that change and constant shift, and it's used as a catalyst in our understanding of the assemblage and the image.
And I have to say something there as an additional point. You do not accept self-other easily there. You know why? Because biopolitics does it for you.
Mm-hmm.
Biopolitics actually wants you to accept people for biopolitical thinking and people for necropolitical, people for a taxonomy of biopoliticizing. So in that sense, self and other, of course, is an ethical positioning, but only as an ethical positioning. And the next colleagues will be completely addressing that. Of course, there is self and other. Of course, we belong to biopolitical and necropolitical regimes, and they are different often. But the complex moment where you want to redress that is exactly what biopolitical realism may be all about in the end. And here I want to address why all those Greek films are empty. I didn't have an answer before lockdown happened. They are empty, by the way. There's no other national filmmaking decade that has included so many empty city spaces or house spaces, or the both, and the both actually. Why? Then the lockdown happened, and I realized that if you so much want to talk biopolitics, to talk how a population is managed at the level constant of the population and to the one body, and at the level and the one body, you may as well go about showing groups managed, but you may as well want to show them out there, because if you do manage a population, you can call them out or call them in. So somehow all these empty cities means that population is somewhere. They were put somewhere, and these lone figures like walk.
Yeah, so they are indexes actually of spectral presences that are like stored somewhere. Unfortunately, and there are a lot of very interesting questions in the chat, and we can only take 1 or 2 minutes to address some of them at least before we round up the discussion of this part, because we need to have like a very short break as well and give the second panel equal time. So I can also ask Dimitris or Geli to take their pick, because there's quite a lot. I think Angel's question about the landscapes was addressed, Juan's question as well. There is a question about to Geli about the prism structure, or the metaphor of the prism, if you can say a few things about that, and a question about the degree in which the use of the Greek language in the films that Dimitris was talking about can be is a kind of is part of the wave, or is it language bound basically? Is there something to the use of the Greek language or not that links it to the weird wave? And yeah, there is also the last comment by Nella. Reads more contemporary rendering of a more contemporary rendering of that Dimitris' intersectionality as it concerns people which assemblage might not cover. And I think this goes to the Dimitris' comment about the assemblage, right? The previous comment. Well, thank you. Last words, last comments before we take a short break.
I will just note that the prism structure, the prism, there's no, at least I'm not familiar with the prism theory per se, but this was more like an attempt to use, to see how an optical device and the function and agency of an optical device can inform a reading of what John Locke calls a fractivus, since through this theory of optics, the result from light fracturing through a prism is achieving the multiplicity, but in a more assembly way, if you will. So something that is not exclusive and overlapping, but comprising an entity. I'm not sure if this answers. I'm seriously stressed with time, but I mean, I would be happy to share my work if there is more questions coming from that, and if they're relevant to someone else's inquiries.
Okay, and I mean, 15 seconds for all these questions that are great, and we can keep on discussing. Don't forget that we're here for the day. Dystopic apocalyptic films often show these empty spaces precisely because they actually relate to political moments. 2, yes, intersectionality, a frame that I very much use. I don't want to undermine frame, neither do I ever undermine in my work minimal, even minimal essentializing, but certainly the moment of identity positioning. What I'm saying though, and this goes with all this theory of assemblage, is that this does not stand out of intersectionality, is a different way to think of the mechanics of it in contemporary world. Last but not least, language. That's a question about whether it. I don't think there is a specific side to Greek language that is weird, but certainly language games. And here again, just to finish with a mention to Geli, there's a famous essay by Geli on language games and cinema, with particular reference to the Greek weird wave, as is also one of your colleagues, Eugenie Brinkema, who has written this magnificent treatise of Lanthimos's Dogtooth on the basis of the constitutive constant awkwardness of language, full stop. Not Greek language, of language.
Thank you both, and I know there was time pressure. Sorry about that, but I mean, if we have some time in the end, we can return to some of these questions. But for now, a huge thanks to both of you. This has been a great discussion, and let's take a very short break. I would say 3 minutes or so to grab a coffee or stretch a bit, and then we'll move on with the second group. Okay, so we'll be back in a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Maria and Dimitri.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just test. Is my camera working? My mic working? Yeah, I can hear you. So shall we start in a minute? Or two? Or one? All right, ready when you are. I hope everyone's back also in the participants room because we're going to start again. So in the following hour, we will listen to presentations by Ipek, Çelik, Rappas, Diego, Benegas, Loyo, and Liesbeth Minnaard. And as in the previous part, these speakers will also respond to each other's work. We will start with a joint talk by Ipek, Çelik, Rappas, and Diego, Benegas, Loyo, because they wrote a chapter together for our Palgrave book, a chapter on refugee art. And Liesbeth Minnaard is, of course, the author of another chapter in the same book, in which she writes on a theater script titled Lampedusa. So before giving these authors the floor, let me briefly introduce them to you. Ipek, Çelik, Rappas is an assistant professor of media and visual arts at Koç University in Istanbul. She is the author of the monograph In Permanent Crisis, Ethnicity in Contemporary Media, in which she analyzes how mass media depictions become invoked by film to frame ethnic and racial otherness in Europe as adornments of catastrophe. And in her work, she also focuses on the representation of minorities in European cinema and popular European film and television productions. Diego Benegas Loyo is a professor of emergency psychology and science, as well as technology at National University of General San Martín in Buenos Aires. As a psychoanalyst and social researcher, he specializes in trauma and political subjectivity. He is the co-author of Los Cuerpos Expuestos, a collection on emergency and catastrophe. And he has worked with refugees at numerous projects, for instance, at New York's Bellevue Hospital. Then Liesbeth Minnaard, the co-editor, of course, of the book we present today, as well as co-organizer of this workshop, and my colleague in Leiden, because she is also an assistant professor in film and literary studies at Leiden University. Her areas of expertise are critical migration studies, post-colonial studies, intersectionality, exitism, and Europe in crisis. She is the author of, well, amongst many other publications, the monograph New Germans, New Dutch, Literary Interventions, and she's currently working on a book on contemporary protest literature. So, Ipek and Diego, I'll give the word to you, and let's put up your PowerPoint. I can do that for you if you want. Let me see where my playlist is. Yep, there it is. And if all is well, you can operate it yourselves. Could you try? Yep.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Liesbeth, Maria, and Janna for, first of all, obviously editing the volume. It's amazing. And also for organizing this conference. I think it's a brilliant idea to actually get the contributors talking. And thanks all the participants for being here. So obviously we're talking about a certain group of works, and there's many other works that are excluded in this category that I'm sure you might be familiar with. But we kind of try to come up with a certain trend that we see in refugee art practices. And then we'll talk about Nela Milic's work, and I think she's still around. I mean, I'm really glad that we have her also in the audience. So if you have any questions for Nela, maybe Nela can raise her hand or, answer as we do as well, we might. So on January 2016, a few months after the publication of Alain Kurdi's image, Ai Weiwei posed as Kurdi, as you probably know the image. The photo was taken in the island of Lesbos, a key entry into the EU for many refugees, where Ai Weiwei visited reportedly in order to document the migrant crisis. During his visit, the artist volunteered at a refugee camp, shared pictures of the living conditions in the camp on his Instagram account. Through empathy and what critics call over-identification, Ai's performance about refugees tries to account for the story of someone else, claiming to be the witness of a horror happening in front of our eyes. Critics emphasize that Ai's posing to translate the horrors of refugee experience into meaning fails in this endeavor. What needs to be fleshed out is not only Ai's failure, but also the artist's choice of image to be imitated, the expectations from the original image in haunting its spectator, and conveying an irreducible reality of pain. The trauma of the refugee experience is assumed to be most faithfully reflected in the silent image of the corpse of an innocent victim. Our article in the edited volume explores a number of artworks that respond to the so-called refugee crisis in Europe. It examines refugee-related art activism that has drawn media attention, such as Ai Weiwei's work, as emblematic of what we call performances of crisis. Performances of crisis built an affective landscape in which refugees are represented as objects of scandalized spectacles that remain outside the quotidian lives of Europeans. We argue that what is missing in such performances of crisis is the desire of refugees, that is, any desire that goes beyond narratives of suffering, and also any interpellation of the host society other than becoming concerned citizens. We then discuss refugee art that is uncommon and less visible, mainly focusing on Nella Milic's Wedding Bellas, a digital photography and oral history project exploring a group of Londoner refugee women's quotidian experiences, struggles, and desires. In its attempt to convey irreducible realities, refugee art becomes speechless, somber, and sad. Ai is not the only artist to take his subject, the tragic deaths of refugees in their attempts to cross the borders of Europe. Banu Cennetoğlu, she has an ongoing installation called The List that traces information related to over 35,000 refugees and migrants who lost their lives on the borders of or in Europe since 1993. It's an ongoing work, occasionally published and distributed by newspapers such as The Guardian, and exhibited in numerous European cities, for instance, in Score, in Amsterdam, or in Liverpool Biennale. Along with identification of victims, the list includes gruesome details, such as the causes of their deaths. I quote, "Beaten by border guards in the port of Igoumenitsa attempting to reach Italy, dead in hospital in Greece," unquote. Or, quote, "Suicide, failed asylum seeker, hanged himself in park in South Shields," unquote. Cennetoğlu's approach differs sharply from Ai's, as she makes no attempt to identify with refugees or pick a particularly scandalized image. Yet, like Ai's performance, her installations deal with refugees who cannot convey their own stories because they have died. Beyond the problematic voicelessness of refugees, there is an enforced narrative genre, that of tragedy, which is central to the performance of crisis. Performances of crisis are no laughing matter. They're sad. They even strive to make the spectators cry, as did Cuban artist Tania Bruguera's work exhibited in Tate Modern. Bruguera's installation was accompanied with a crying room in which a chemical compound was released to make the visitors cry. Bruguera explains, I quote, "Life is not comfortable. I want people to get out of their comfort zone, unquote. So this forced crying, on the one hand, imposes on the spectator the proper reaction, so-called proper reaction, when confronted with refugee experience. It also marks a discontinuity between the spectator's comfort zone and refugee lives. So performances of crisis, in their focus on pain and death, avoid the economy of pleasures that refugee bodies may provide in the quotidian lives of the spectators. They are not the working bodies that make European houses cleaner, child rearing and elderly care more comfortable, or food easier to acquire. The aforementioned artworks neglect that some lives are rendered more comfortable because of the labor, or thanks to the labor, such as cleaning. This is not limited to, but including cleaning, caretaking, agricultural work that refugees and migrants do, that are extracted from refugee bodies. Not only the presence and labor of refugees that facilitate lives in the global north hardly exist in refugee-related artworks, refugees as seekers of various kinds of pleasures are also rarely the subject of such performances. And this brings us to Nela Milic's Wedding Bellas, and I'll leave the word, and Diego will talk about this work.
Okay. I'll take from where Ipek left. Thanks to the organizers. I thank you. And so, as Ipek was saying, we looked at these pieces of art, and then we come to compare, to have a different approach. And we see here a woman in bridal gown peacefully smiling as she leans her head on a traditional red British mailbox, passionately attached to the object of her marriage. She seems happy that becoming Mrs. British Mailbox will make her a Queen's subject. Milic's Wedding Bellas, born out of the artist's interaction with refugee women at the Migrants Resource Centre in East London, include such uncommon representations of refugee women, including the artist herself, which you can see her. Wedding Bellas are photo shoots of refugee women in wedding gowns posing for the camera while hugging signposts, street lights, trees, mailboxes, security camera posts, or fountains. Milic recounts that the project started in 2007 with a conversation about love and how much women are willing to give in order to find someone rooted, stable, and not going away. What can be more rooted than a tree, or more stable than a signpost? From this casual joke, the project evolved into a calendar of pictures, a photography workshop to train future photographers for New Londoner, which is a newspaper developed to counter the image, to combat bad portrayals of migrants in the media, and also several exhibits. Then next, if you can change. Many of the photographed women have moved numerous times around the world within London. In the photos, we see their desire to be settled, rooted as European citizens, but through mock wedding pictures marrying not UK citizens, but other UK subjects or objects. Contrasting to the innocence of the white dress to the frequent accusation of fake marriages, these images show the precarious situation of women refugees who desire to remain in Europe through the utopia of prosperity. In a book chapter and an article she published, Milic recounts the making of Wedding Bellas and provides more detailed information about the women in the photos. The details include relatable quotidian problems that may be consequences of their precarious migrant status. These problems are always coupled with their coping mechanisms. For example, we have a couple quotes. Aneta has 4 jobs. She wakes up at 4 in the morning and makes abstract paintings. When you're working so much, the world is an abstract feature that you can only feel through repetition that sustains it. Jobera has always felt a sense of longing for belonging as an outsider not fitting into any community and mentally struggling most of her life. She has reached a stage and an age she no longer cares about what people think of her. Similar to the performances of Crisis, in Wedding Bellas the refugee body is at the center of the viewer's eye. However, it stands there in its radiance and glamour. The genre of the wedding picture is used as imagery that is the most rehearsed visual performance of happiness. This is a gendered conception of happiness, one specifically attributed to women. We encounter a performance of gender that connects refugees to a wider cultural rim of femininity and traditional expectations. To the male spectator, these photographs send a especially interesting message that these women are simply uninterested. The photographs play on marriage as a path to UK citizenship and also hint at the catalogues of mail-order brides. These images also point out the wish to be recognized as subjects with rights to desire, and at times not to desire, male UK citizens. Men are nowhere to be seen in these pictures. The pictures give centrality to the women, not by making them the object of exchange, but rather by making them agents of desire in the center of the frame. So in conclusion, performances of Crisis are horrifying and their terror is assumed to emerge away from the quotidian. Lists give gruesome details about the ways refugees die in Europe, and images of dead children multiply in mimicry performances. The horrifying affects of these performances help build that spatial and conceptual separation between refugee and European lives. Wedding Bellas, in their modeling for the photo shoots in wedding gowns, bring into question categorizations such as refugee women or happily ever after. Wedding Bellas make their spectators smile and invite them into a shared joke as they raise questions about what it means to be a citizen of the most surveilled city in the world, or what it means to be a woman in a European country, and whether we can be someone other than a concerned spectator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diego. Inspiring talk. I'm going to mute you now. We'll talk later about your presentation. I'm going to give the words to Liesbeth right away. Go ahead, Liesbeth.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Janna, for the previous introduction. Hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm also grateful to my two co-organizers that they allowed me to be in this panel and to share some of the insights from my contribution. And I'll start right away, but because we've already seen that time is very limited. So the subtitle of my contribution, titled Lampedusa in Europe, this being a central claim, starting point, and the idea that Lampedusa is not just this worrisome site located in the European margins, but rather at the heart of Europe. The situation there symptomatic for the European Union's, in many respects, faltering governmentality. The subtitle is Touching Tales of Vulnerability. Now, this mentioned vulnerability does not, as my main title might suggest, primarily concern migrants and refugees, the infelicitous protagonists of the so-called European migration crisis, at least not in the first place, but rather what you could maybe call minor Europeans, working class European citizens in Lampedusa, but also in North Yorkshire or in Leiden de Kooi for that matter. trying to tread water, struggling to survive, and in this process growing more and more disillusioned, suspicious and hostile towards whatever and whoever they feel obstructs their surviving of their crisis every day, and their crisis ordinary. Now, the case study that I discuss in my contribution to the volume, a theatre text by the acclaimed British playwright Anders Lustgarten titled Lampedusa, a seemingly programmatic and in that sense also effectively misleading title, directed me in writing this article towards the significance and the value of intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity as a positive and empowering force in the current crisis landscape, a landscape that I see as determined by multiple crises, which in my article I propose to consider as touching tales. And that's a concept that I borrow from Leslie Adelson. So touching tales rather than as singular and separate and even competing situations of crisis, as dominant crisis rhetoric wants to make us believe or has a stake in making us believe. Now, in this case study, and it's a play that was staged in, as you can see here, in various places across Europe, and that consists of two monologues of two characters that neither know nor meet each other in this text. So in this case study, two tales touch. The story of the European refugee crisis, as told by an Italian fisherman, he's called Stefano in the text, sharing his Southern European working class male perspective on the present. This story touches the story of the European social welfare crisis, as told by a female mixed race debt collector in the north of England, Denise, and vice versa. Their narratives, their separate narratives, resonate, affects, and meaning in relation to each other, despite their appearance and very striking separation in the text. Now, it is through that juxtaposition, so I argue, through the formal suggestion of a dialogue, that they prompt the reader to reflect on this touching, on their proximity. What do these stories have to do with each other? How do they relate to each other? But also on its effects. So what's the affective dimension of that touching? The touching effect of these two stories of straddling the crisis ordinary. Prompting us to think about these two average Europeans, their particular, their singular, but in a sense also common, shared narratives of disenfranchisement and despair, their proximity and their separation. The apparently unmotivated juxtaposition of their stories becomes a powerful strategy. Both protagonists provide the reader with a bitter taste of their daily tribulations, both on Lampedusa and in North Yorkshire. We see how they struggle to make ends meet, how they scramble for modes of living on in a Europe that is harsh and inhospitable, not only for the migrants arriving on the shores of Lampedusa, or trying to do so, but also for its so-called legitimate or legal inhabitants. And while both these characters decidedly perform as resilient citizens, doing jobs that no one wants, holding on, bouncing back, their stories point at a widespread pattern of precarity that affects the Mediterranean working class as much as it hits the so-called common people in the north of England. A pattern that is, so both monologues suggest, at least partly the result of the careless technocratic politics that reigns Europe, that currently reigns Europe's dismantling whatever remains of a protective social infrastructure. However, and here comes the, I suppose, more upbeat part of my panel input now, these two narratives of disenfranchised EU citizens in vulnerable positions both contain a turning point, which makes them transition from narratives of despair into narratives of hope, of expectation, of futurity. Ultimately, in this play, Lampedusa, and this is a sudden insight for both the characters as well as the reader, as well as for the reader, the protagonist's vulnerability, their undoubted vulnerability, neither erases their agency nor their capacity to resist, which so often seems to be the case. So in both stories, it is through small and unexpected acts of kindness that the protagonists come to realize their significance to others, a realization that has an empowering effect, small as it may be, on their resilient but also very isolated, lonely subjectivities. Now, it is by locating change and hope in small but impactful moments of intersubjectivity, melodramatic as these moments in the text may appear, or as they appear to me as a reader, it is by doing so that Lampedusa, in my opinion, criticizes and breaks away from the idealization of an ethos of endurance, breaks away from a strategically individualized neoliberal ideology. Now, let me wrap up now by putting the hesitation that I felt to conclude my reading or my analysis of this work of crisis literature in a such like almost optimistic register, and my inclination to dismiss Lampedusa's message of hope, of care as melodramatic, not serious, too sentimental, over the top. Let's put that up for discussion. Now, as does the literary text itself when it concludes with Stefano's words to his audience, to the reader, and to me as a scholar, and words that I repeat here. I defy you. So that's the concluding words of the play. I defy you. I call on you. I challenge you to feel hope, as does Stefano say at the end of the play of Lampedusa, and to allow this hope to work as a positive and imaginative force. It seems desperately lacking and much needed belief in the disruptive and constructive value of imagining the future otherwise, in a neoliberal world and within a neoliberal crisis discourse that seems to have colonized our imagination. Thank you. That's what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Liesbeth. So I'm going to give the word to Ipek and Diego now. Would you like to respond briefly to Liesbeth's talk?
Yes, in fact, I really enjoyed reading your article and learning about the work of Lustgarten also, and this particular play, which I didn't know about. And I think it's an amazing idea to consider this play and its two narratives within this theoretical framework of Adelson's touching tales, and it's sort of interconnected in a rather effective manner. I have to say, when I first started reading about the fisherman's narrative, I was very skeptical. And towards the end, you yourself say, well, this actually, it doesn't go beyond much of these refugee narratives that place these white men's conscience in the center and the white rescuer of non-white victims and is redeemed by, there's that element of being redeemed by by this position of a hero, right? But you already mentioned this in the article. And then comes the second narrative, that of Denise, and it doesn't seem like the play wants to sort of, they're connected, but it doesn't give you something about this is the way how it's connected. It's sort of like leaving it to your imagination a little bit. And but you brilliantly suggest that this is systemic critique of the connection between what's called so-called separate, or as you said now, separated crises, the refugee crisis, social welfare crisis, and financial crisis, right? So I think what we have common between our articles is this interest in narratives or images that situate the so-called refugee crisis within the larger social and political issues, right? Within precarity, within racism, economic crisis, and we're both interested in narratives that find this sort of interconnectivity and do not exclude what is related to refugees and migrants from what belongs to Europe, what is a European problem, essentially. So my question, I have a question regarding the name of the play, which you kind of briefly mentioned at, I think, in the beginning of your presentation, this two narrative structure. But so it's taking place in Lampedusa and Northern England, but the title of the play is Lampedusa. And at some point you say in the article, Lampedusa is not only in Europe, Lampedusa is Europe, right? So could you talk a little bit more about that, about the symbolic significance of Lampedusa over Northern England, maybe? And if there's also time, I would actually, if you could talk a little bit about the performances, because you mentioned in a footnote, and you actually had it on the PowerPoint also, and you say that it was performed in London, Greece, Germany, Malta, and there's very site-specific interpretation. So what is, I mean, I don't know if you got a chance to see these performances, of course, or watch them, but I'm wondering how they are site-specific necessarily.
Thank you, Ipek. Yeah, Liesbeth, would you like to respond to those questions on how Lampedusa somehow becomes a pars pro toto for Europe, if I translate that right, that point, and also, yeah, how the play was performed and how site-specific those performances can be read?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to do that, of course, and I'll try to keep it, well, short, because I'd also like to respond to your wonderful article. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Ipek, and also for kind of, well, taking this opportunity and sharing or telling a bit more about, well, my discomfort with the play as well, and I think that's much more there in the article than it was now, because I wanted to, well, focus on this message of hope. But there is actually in one of the two narratives this story that, well, fits this kind of stereotypical story about the white man's conscience, etc. But yeah, I think what's I have, like, working on the story, I tend to like the English, the British story better than the kind of the stereotypical one. But then I think it only works through the juxtaposition, which is extremely interesting, I think, and which almost makes you forgive a bit about, well, all the missteps in one story. And I think that's so interesting and relates to this idea of, well, calling the play Lampedusa. And I mean, it is about Lampedusa as well, but it's not the story. Well, it's the story you expect, and at the same time, it's so much more than that. And it's definitely more about, well, what happens there happens in many places, in many, well, sub or marginal areas in cities, or well, in the country and in the rest of Europe. And I think it's in doing so that the play really kind of disables you to think like, okay, this is a problem of well, Southern Europe. This is a Mediterranean problem, and this is something, well, we maybe have to solve there. We're not very successful at it, but we kind of see it as a problem that's there, and let's make sure that it doesn't get to us. But in the play, you actually see that, well, this kind of the structural dysfunctioning is already there. It's everywhere, and would actually be well, good to realize that. And maybe that's also what interested me in the play, is that so often it's suggested that it's especially this working class, for instance, in Northern England, that would have a problem with refugees, and that would have a problem with whatever is happening in the Mediterranean in that respect. And I think that's such a well, discursive strategy to kind of dismiss two groups, or to oppose two groups that are actually, well, suffering from the same dismantling of, well, the kind of the protective structure that maybe was once there. Sorry, that was way too long, but and about the place, actually, I have to admit, I haven't seen different site-specific performances, unfortunately, and in the play I also make clear, like, I'm really focusing on the text, but yeah, so I can't say anything about it.
Thank you, Liesbeth, for your elaborate answer. Would you also like to respond to Ipek and Diego now?
Yeah, I definitely like to do that. I really enjoyed reading your contribution, or rereading your contribution now for this occasion, and particularly liked how in your analysis of Nila Milic Wedding Bells you bring the performance of happiness, of pleasure, a gendered performance of pleasure, very tongue-in-cheek. There's the irony, there's, well, the marriage, the ironic take on marriage, into this generally very alarmist discourse on crisis, almost as a statement, breaking out of the prescribed, and as you argue, strongly limiting frame of sadness, cruelty, suffering that ties the refugee subject of or in crisis to a passive position of victimhood, and to the narrative tragedy, as you just pointed out, the narrative genre of the tragedy, and this one-dimensional plot that's always there. Now, just to point out some possible topics of debate, or things that struck me in your text, insights that we could explore a bit further during this panel, is maybe first a general observation or issue, the always vexed question of terminology or categorization, and the role, the position of the artist in this. In your title, you choose for the term refugee art, and in your contribution, you extended to refugee-related art activism, an activism that often consists of telling the refugee story, and the horror story, as you call it, and of thus giving voice to the voiceless, turning the artist's position in that of a translator or conveyor of these tragic and traumatic refugee stories. Now, I think it's safe to say that we both present readings of artworks, so Milic, Wedding Bells, and Lustgarten's Lampedusa, that, in our opinion, with their messages of happiness and hope, escape this single story, or provide alternative narratives of the so-called refugee crisis. I hesitate, however, to call, or to, for instance, call Lustgarten's play refugee art or refugee-related art. And then not only because the refugee characters in his play are merely minor characters, the central protagonists being these two Europeans, but also because I'm hesitant to opt for a term that takes an identitarian category that's often so unfit, so reductive, as your analysis actually demonstrates at its core, and thus also possibly mystifies, in a sense, the system and structures, or the politics that puts people in such like position. And my hesitation about the term may also concern the all too easy conflation of the topic of the artwork, the issue it addresses with the identity or the position of the artist. And let me, against that background, maybe pose the following rather provocative question, a question that indirectly concerns the significant differences between the positions of the two artists whose work we studied. Milic, a female artist of refugee backgrounds, whose photographic performances of refugee happiness and refugee desire indeed provide us with a perspective that's sorely missing. And then Anders Lustgarten, a white European male, well-intentioned activist, a position which almost automatically transforms his refugee crisis-related work to literature of concern. And you already mentioned this centrality of the white guilty conscience and white saviorism, patterns of white saviorism. So, yeah, can it be, and that's the question, that it is actually also Milic's background, her authority of experience, which is often, or which is totally complex, that allows her, that facilitates her, legitimates her depictions of refugee happiness. And I'd really be relieved if this wasn't the case. But I think within the current discursive formation in which privilege is acknowledged and discussed in very critical terms, and rightly so, I just wonder, and I realize I have to be very short. So the last point I'd like to bring up concerns the eye-opening way in which you reflect on how the conventional, horrifying, violent images of refugees as victims not only work to desensitize audiences, but also to discipline them. At the very end of your text, discipline them into passivity, into staying put. And there you use this idea of a pedagogy of cruelty and how that functions, how we learn to fear the powerful rather than to question system or to dare to resist. And I was just wondering, so what do you think? Can we say then that Milic's wedding bellas activates a different way, counters this pedagogy of cruelty with what you could maybe call a pedagogy of happiness, a pedagogy of desire that's encouraging rather than desensitizing. Sorry.
Thank you, Liesbeth. So Ipek and Diego, you may respond.
In fact, is there a way to, I think Nella is there, and there are some questions in the chat box actually for Nella. I feel like she would respond maybe better to these particular questions. Is there a way to include her in the
live so she can participate in our discussion? I could.
In the meanwhile, I'll try to talk about the reason. I mean, it's kind of, as you say, we use different terms in the article, refugee-related art, refugee art. I mean, it's kind of hard to sort of pin down. I mean, first of all, refugee and migrant and asylum seeker are terms that keep on sort of being used interchangeably. Usually there's legal differences between them. So it's hard to sort of, in a way, I mean, shall we go and ask, okay, what's the status of this person? I think what we're getting at in general is these works of art that claim that there's an issue that is not being seen. There's a refugee problem and we're not seeing it. As if the media is not representing this problem enough, these works of art try to make this problem visible and claim that they try to make this problem visible by a certain scandalized performances, either visually scandalized or in Banu Jannetol's case, rather verbally scandalized imagery or making you cry. Rather, there's a certain sort of tragedy and scandalization of the event. So, yes, maybe we didn't use the right kind of term, but I guess this is what we're getting at by the kind of works, what we call performance of crisis. I don't know if Nella is in, or shall I be talking about her work before maybe I give the word to Diego? Maybe he can talk a little bit more about the pedagogy of cruelty part. Janna?
So because we cannot make her live, Nela, if you can hear me, I think you have to put on your own microphone and camera. Yes. And now we can, hi, there you are.
I have to leave in 8 minutes. My class is starting, so.
Well then the floor is yours.
No, I didn't want to participate. I'm just enjoying this, and I think this is Diego's and Ipek's time, so I don't want to take up. But I just wanted to add, maybe in this kind of scandalizing realm, we responded as people who have been examining the idea of Western beauty and the aesthetics. And one of the things that we found in the kind of popular culture has been a Pirelli calendar, which is like, if you teach photography like I do, this is the representation of women in the kind of Western context, like naked women with the oil spilled all over, which is like the capitalist catastrophe that is kind of represented in the body of the naked woman. It's like a madness. And we were just thinking, you know what, this is equally offensive to us as it is our own representation that exists in everyday media, which is wailed, crying, poverty, women with children. Like we have been, in some camps, like we have been so indecent in our own representation that we have found that also the representation of Western women is equally indecent. So in that sense, I'm offended in every way you want. And this is why the images ended up being what they have been. We just wanted to represent some kind of decent people in some decent circumstances with aspirational kind of idea of belonging to the territory that we ended up landed on. And that territory requires us to comply with some kind of, let's say, a Western idea of not only beauty, but innocence or Catholicism, even considering that we had to wear these kind of white wedding dresses, even though there was an option for Jabida that has been shown to wear a red sari, which would be traditionally something that she would normally wear. But she chose that if she's going to get married in England, even though it is for the street sign, she is going to be in that white wedding dress. So, yeah, it's a kind of a madness of these cues, visual cues as well, that we wanted to embrace and represent as women who have a choice to make the decision of which cues we take on and which are the ones that we reject. That's it.
Okay. Bye-bye. I was just leaving. So there's also a question in the chat by Auntie, who has a question to Ipek and Diego. Let me see. Asking if I understand right, you claim that while A's work can be seen as a performance of crisis, Nela's project moves beyond that, perhaps towards a performance of critique. Could you elaborate on this sort of critique and its workings?
Diego, would you like to take that? We don't hear you. No.
Let me see if I can help out.
We heard him before. Yeah. Also.
No, I cannot unmute Diego now.
I think it happens so slowly that maybe you click multiple times and then you unmute yourself again. It's not happening. In the meanwhile, I'll answer, as he's trying to unmute himself, I'll answer the question that comes before then. You can. Do you know if is there, in order to mock, could these photos be appropriated by those who are opposed to immigration in order to mock refugee motivations? In fact, Nela, in her article, she talks about how not appropriation, but actually people's kind of blunt reactions. She had an exhibit and some guy just came to her and said, "Did you take these pictures? Go home." you know, sort of really rather racist and blunt reactions of, especially from a man who is, I guess, sort of a masculine kind of offense to his masculinity that these women are hugging signposts rather than men. But I mean, I feel like it's more of a mock. I think it's quite tongue-in-cheek, and I'm not sure how he could appropriate a picture of a woman who's sort of hugging this signpost. It's really making fun of that kind of, you know, the fake weddings trope that these people are there to marry our men and, you know, get these citizenships and stuff. So I think it's kind of rather clear that, from what I know, I mean, it caused stir, but not really any appropriation in that way.
Okay.
We still
No, I cannot hear you. You could try to re-enter. If you leave the room and then re-enter, sometimes it starts working again.
Yeah, just refresh, to be honest. Also,
yeah,
it's quite well at the moment. There has been problems with this program the whole week. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just continue. I'll continue. So, Auntie asked about the. Hello, by the way, Auntie. It's really nice to have you there. I mean, she would know much more about what we're talking about, but we kind of made this intervention a little out of our field. But what we're talking about critique and the way it works, and I wish maybe Nella talked a little bit more about it when she was around, is that, I mean, it's done collectively. You cannot do this critique in a way, I'm going to come and talk about your problems. I'm going to come and make your problems visible. Nella was there. I mean, everything about this project is collective. Even the way we met Nella was rather in a collective way. And the reason why we wanted to sort of talk about her project, we met her at a conference. I gave a presentation about these performances of crisis. And she said, hey, actually, I have a project that tries to approach this in a different way. And, you know, then we sort of looked at the project together, talked about the project together. But also she did this project over a bunch of years with, actually, it's a part of a multiple project of workshop, kind of living, being there, living, doing these photo shots. Even the dresses were actually taken from women who were willing to give them other refugee, I can't remember, like, or not, women who were willing to actually share their wedding dresses with for the photo shoot. So I believe part of the critique and the way it works is rather not to sort of, I'm going to give you a voice, but maybe create that voice. Let's create that voice together and find what we're talking about as we are doing this project collectively. So maybe change the subject and make arts rather more about a collective kind of.
Now you hear me? Oh, you hear me? Okay. Talking about giving voice. But I remember that she was surprised in one of the occasions because she problematized the idea of, like, sure, do you want to show yourself in a wedding dress because you don't want to get married and this and that? And one of the women said, like, of course I want to. I will never use a wedding dress on my own. So I want to be in the pictures with the wedding dress. And I think that surprise is interesting there too, because it's not something that was thought by the artist outside, but it was something of a production and of a dialogue. I wanted to say, just because I have 1 second, but because I could enter again, I wanted to say a little bit about this issue that you were mentioning, Liesbeth, about the separation, and that because the separation of the viewer and the from the history, the stories and affects of the refugee in what we we don't call them the traditional pictures or images of refugee crisis, but we might. These of the narratives of tragedies, because our question was, how does this affect what it makes you feel works politically? What is the political / affective work of this piece of art? And one thing that we saw in every occasion is this separation. Like, this doesn't have anything to do with you. This horror is happening somewhere else, and I think, and what we started to thinking is that exactly that, precisely that is what is doing, and so it is critical that for the oppressed people of the North Europe, let's say, for the oppressed people of the central countries in the North, to see themselves as very far away from those who come from the sea, from the Mediterranean, let's say, from the south, because in that sense they are not so oppressed, or they feel that they have something that these people don't. So I would argue that it's critical to sustain in the North, the oppressed people of the North. We're privileged because in that way we have somebody like below, and we lose. That separation then becomes central to the political affective work of the piece of art. So in that sense is that we track these affects and horror or desensitization that the piece of art does to the viewer or with the viewer, and in that sense is where we find in Nela Milić's production something different, something that it goes to different affects, to different. It produces something different. However, like we have that man that entered the exhibit and said, like, he's horrified and he is very upset. And I think that there's something else, but we'll talk in a little bit. But because this happiness or this fun or this the other affects that it convokes are doing a different kind of work, and they are pointing somewhere else. And in that sense is that we might talk about hope. I don't know, but it is another problem. But because we mentioned this man, this anecdote made us think about what does it do to a man, and that's how we. And by a man I mean like a male, white male. Person with the kind of privileges, gender privileges, which, because men are not there, in a sense, in that production, men are not needed, and in that sense, I think it is provoking for us, and is also it also provokes the male viewer, because is the one who holds the power. The power to enter Europe, etc. So I would say that.
Thank you. I think that also responds to many of the issues that were raised in the chat. We are running a little bit late. I wanted to take one more question because Maria just said that she also wanted to ask something in the chat. Maria, could you make yourself live? Can you make yourself live? No. Well, yeah, there you are. Now you're gone then.
Yes, I'll be brief because we are running out of time. But I actually wanted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask something that also has to do with actually what Diego was addressing now in his comments about hope and the effective structure of hope, and related to actually what Liesbeth was talking about before. And how the play Lampedusa ended with hope as a kind of defiance, as a kind of resistance, if I understood it correctly. But there is, of course, an ambivalence to the whole concept of hope and the effective structure of hope. It can be, it can work as a, resistance as a resource that enables people or communities to persist, improve their lives, eventually achieve happiness. But it can also be very much embedded in a neoliberal structure that minimizes resistance and exacerbates cruel optimism and doesn't work as an empowering force, but quite the opposite, right? So I think some have argued how hope or hopefulness are basically for those, are sold to those to whom the world is not able or willing to offer anything else, right? So those who actually don't have much chance at another future. So what kind of hope, how are we to understand the politics of hope in Lampedusa and the ending of Lampedusa? And yeah, that was...
Does it escape this cruel optimism that you also mentioned in your chapter?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course, that's a very good question. And it's actually, I go into this cruel optimism, and for both, or especially for the British character, there is this idea, okay, when I finish my education, when I do this, when I do that, then things will change, etc. And maybe, well, maybe this is also an opportunity to open up this panel to the other panelists, because it was actually Dimitris who made me think much more about this hope, because I think in previous readings of this work I kind of really dismissed it and said, like, well, it's melodramatic, and the ending, it's well, as I said, over the top, etc. And then he actually afterwards came to me and said, like, well, why can there be a critical dimension? Or he's already to melodrama. Why do we dismiss it that easily? And I also have the feeling that in working, it's much easier to end on a critical kind of skeptic note about well, the future than on a positive note. And I think it actually within the play, it works quite well because there's both. No, there's you're very aware as a reader or as a spectator that hope is really in very small things, or that it's really attached to daily, well, to someone being kind to you and thinking like, well, maybe tomorrow this person will be kind again. No, that's already kind of the dimension of hope that's very meaningful in this play. And since I don't think that's that these characters or people in this position will change the world, or the world will change that easily. I think it's really important to have these kind of small, well, inklings of hope to well, just stay positive, more than cruel optimism. So.
Thanks, Liesbeth. I think we're going to close on this upbeat conclusion of yours, because we're well due over time. I hope to see you back at 5, because then we'll have Nilgun Bayraktar's keynote lecture. Yeah, it's a pity we don't have time to open up the discussion to the entire panel, but I think we've talked enough. Yeah, see you back in about 45 minutes. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.